rescheduling of the last meeting. Thank you for arranging your schedules to be here today. We have a lot to get to today. I think we're starting to really get into the substance of the work with kind of a discussion of some of the draft recommendations from our subcommittees, which we want to go through today. So want to leave as much time for that as possible. First order of business is approval of the minutes from the prior meeting. I believe, Lisa, those were distributed to the work group over email. Hopefully everyone's had the chance to review them. So now is the opportunity to request any changes or corrections to them. If there are no changes or corrections, we'll take a motion to approve.
I have a comment. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you,
This
Leslie.
is Leslie. Hi. So Lisa did an excellent job of summarizing Melody Taylor's presentation. But I would just want to say, if anybody actually wants to like cite or refer to anything that Melody said, please go directly to her presentation that's on the website, just so you have it coming from the source. So I would just make that as like a caveat or whatever.
Yep.
I'll make a
Thanks.
motion to accept the minutes from our last meeting.
I'll second.
Anyone opposed? All right, hearing nothing, the minutes are approved. They will be uploaded to the webpage where all the documents of the work group are available, as well as recordings of all of our meetings. Great. So this is we've had a lot of great presentations before this work group, which have, I think, really been helpful in framing the problem and helping to guide some of our discussions and decision making. But we have not arranged for another guest presentation today for the first time to leave the full agenda available for subcommittee discussion. And I want to thank our subcommittee chairs and co-chairs for the work that you've been putting in between the meetings of the full work group and what really looked like some productive and positive conversations, as well as some thoughts on actionable and specific recommendations. This is the opportunity for those subcommittees to go through those recommendations and some of the thought process that went into them, as well as a summary of some of the discussions that have been happening on a subcommittee level, and allow other members who are not on your particular subcommittee to ask questions or to contribute to that work product. So today I envision having some discussion. I envision that we would update the draft recommendations based on today's discussion, circulate the draft subcommittee recommendations in writing to the full work group following the discussions today, and then over the next month or so work to pull together all of those recommendations into a single group. And again, the idea is to once we have that available, have it posted publicly for a month or two for public comment before the report is finalized. And I think that we've also been able to enlist some technical assistance for helping to pull together that final report, which I think one of our subcommittees may speak to. So without further ado, we'll roll right into the subcommittee reports. I'll go in order in which they are listed on the agenda. I think we have Terry Hickey on yet. Looks like we
Me
do.
first, yeah.
Yes, he's here.
Would you mind leading us off, and feel free to share your screen if you have your draft subcommittee recommendations in front of you.
I was going to ask Drew, my share function isn't lit up. I didn't know if that had been disabled.
It may be. I think Lisa,
there you
you're
go.
the host.
It is back.
Okay.
Hold on one sec. Good afternoon, everyone. Felipe had a class conflict, our co-chair, so he will be here next week, but he sends his regrets and will let me run through this quickly. So we've had a number of good conversations. I think we all agreed in the subcommittee that the ideas behind education outreach and engagement underlie really all of the recommendations and discussions coursing through the different subcommittees. We've got some framing language here, and we'll share this with everyone after the meeting. I think there was absolute consensus that one of the main obstacles across the board is resistance for any variety of reasons, and that there needs to be a strong communications and engagement strategy. Felipe sent out to all of us, which if you're interested, I could share with the whole group, but he sent out a compendium of different literature about engagement and communication around affordable housing in a Dropbox. So we've all reviewed that. Felipe provided, I thought, some really nice framing questions about things like who's to be included in this planning, at what point in time. The methodologies are very important. How are we gathering information and building a communications playbook? How are you going to frame it? When we met with Dr. T, she talked quite a bit about how the framing of these issues are really unique to different jurisdictions. And then overall, what's the narrative going to be? And that's a little different everywhere. The basic recommendations, then I would welcome other members of the subcommittee to jump in. There was consensus around the idea that we needed outside expertise. And we've talked on these work group calls previously about seeking outside help. We have talked to some providers of this work and begun some discussions about, from a procurement standpoint, what it would take to bring on a consultant who could work to provide actual services and also possibly training to county officials, local developers, help us set up focus groups and other engagements. We would recommend that we do move forward with that. I won't get into the weeds on this, but the idea would be that the county would issue a request for quotes, identify the appropriate financial resources to bring on a qualified vendor to help us with this work. We'd like to see somebody retained as close to as possible the end of October as we can. I thought this was really an important element of our last conversation, but in this work group in particular, the recommendations are literally only the beginning, and the work group members or the subcommittee members felt strongly that at least members of that subcommittee, other members of the work group, definitely recruited members of the community should continue with this work directly. I think to a person, the subcommittee members would like to stay engaged in an education outreach and communication strategy, be part of these groups, be part of helping to shape that narrative, which I thought was great. In addition to a long-term communication strategy, there was a great deal of interest in a toolkit or shorter-term strategies to work with developers who are going to engage with community members and elected officials in the short term, projects that could possibly be in the pipeline that can't wait for this longer-term process. And so that was certainly something that could be done in-house and in cooperation with a consultant, but all felt that that was important to start to engage community in a smart way. And finally, that all of these efforts around community education really needs to dovetail and be aligned with the other recommendations of the other subcommittees, the overall work group, and any strategic plans the county's going to put forward. But again, this is very driven around the idea of bringing on expertise and following, I think, a proven model in other jurisdictions where we create a playbook, take a lot of public input, and create something that can be used for quite some time. So that is the brief summary, but I will absolutely welcome other subcommittee members who want to weigh in or add your 2 cents. And then if there's questions or commentary, we'd love to engage.
Yeah, Terry, thank you. Why don't we start with any members of your subcommittee that would like to weigh in, and then as people kind of digest these, we'll let others ask questions as well. So anybody from the subcommittee want to weigh in on these?
I was going to just say I thought that was a great summary. That's a great layout of what we talked about and what to do.
Thanks, Dan.
I have a question, Terry, as we start to pull these together, and this is going to be a question for all the subcommittees. As we start to pull these together, I think we'll want to specifically pull out the recommendations that are kind of short term and immediately actionable within the next, couple of months to a year. And you mentioned the desire to retain outside expertise as quickly as possible, even before all of this is finalized, if that's possible. Is there anything else that contained within these that you would say falls into that short-term bucket?
Other than the fact that I think there could be more discussion, we didn't have access to all the different types of developers and other stakeholders in ours. There were a few in our work group, but I think the idea of the short-term toolkit could probably use some additional discussion around what can be done in-house versus bringing someone on. But really, I think getting the consultant on sooner than later and beginning to put the hard work in of planning the strategy. And from everything I've seen, a lot of time on the front end goes into how to build the focus groups and get the input from a cross section of the community. I think we all agree that's got to start right away. So Drew, it's really a number of very short-term achievable goals that would lead to a much longer-term strategy and plan.
On the focus groups, who do you envision being the participants in those? And for trainings, who would be the subjects of training? And do you think it's worth identifying those in the recommendations?
So from conversations we've had, and I keep saying a consultant, we've obviously talked to one in particular who's got a national standing in this work. We'd certainly entertain proposals from others, but in our conversations with Dr. T, and Dan, back me on this if you will, the formation of these focus groups is where a lot of the science and art really comes to play. I could list who I think would be on it, but it seems to me that a lot of time in that particular model is spent thinking about how you can bring a really mixed group of voices to the table, including a healthy dose of those who don't agree with you. As far as the training side of it goes, I think a lot of that gets driven by what the narrative and the messaging is. And so, Dan, you've sort of been part of some of this work in the past. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, just and again, I'm familiar with Dr. T's work, and I think it makes sense to throw the net out wider. But I think we thought that engaging her as soon as possible. I mean, she knows she's done this all over the country, so she. I mean, if it ends up being her, there would be a certain amount of input and wisdom she'd be able to kind of share with us just from her general experience around the country, and perhaps there are other consultants who had that type of experience too. And then in terms of the focus groups, which obviously would take a little longer. My understanding, and she did this in DC, and she did it for a nonprofit in Howard County, and that she pulls together two types of focus groups. One are kind of stakeholder focus groups that would be people like on this work group who are involved in affordable housing development. So that would be, I think, a relatively, small set of focus groups. But I think she also pulls together a broad set of general public focus groups. And this is there's sort of a science to this. I mean, there are firms out there that that make sure it's demographically representative of the county. And those focus groups are just incredibly insightful because you're really getting the general public there. And you get everyday people's sense of how they think about these types of ideas. So my sense is that those are kind of the bulk of the focus groups. I can't, I did have a conversation with her, and maybe there's like 6 or maybe even more than that, 9 of these sort of general public focus groups, and then maybe like 3 or so stakeholder focus groups, something like that. I think those are the numbers that I heard.
I also, from members of the subcommittee, we didn't finalize this because I think we were looking forward to this conversation and trying to think about this moving forward. We didn't nail down details of sort of who should be the group that works with Dr. T. I think there was a unanimous idea amongst the subcommittee that members of this work group, members of the subcommittee, other key folks in this work, not just county employees, could be engaging with Dr. T in the very beginning. Because I think a lot of this, again, Dan said this, there's a science to sort of pulling together a different way to look at this narrative in a way that's a win for everybody, which is very different than the way I think it's normally done. But there definitely needs to be some group working with the consultant that's brought on that represents more than simply the county, or that can be a sort of a help staff and move that along. And so I think when it comes to training, I would imagine, Dan, part of this is kind of learning some of the core themes and model about how this operates so that we can, because so much of this seems tailored. It isn't cookie cutter at all. Even though the issue is pretty ubiquitous, it's very tailored.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how much of the training maybe there could be some training that happens before the focus groups, just based on the general knowledge. But I think, yeah, what Terry just said is really important, that, Baltimore County has its own dynamics and its own citizens that care about certain things. And it'll be really useful to get a deeper understanding. I mean, we have sort of a sense of that from sort of who's vocal, but with a focus group, you really get below that, and you get a sense of like, what's the story, when people hear these things or read them in the paper or see them on TV, what are they thinking? What's the narrative that they have around that?
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry. I got totally bumped out.
Can I raise a question?
Please. Sure.
I'm on the zoning committee, and we've talked about kind of different approaches, and clearly there are opportunity areas that have older affordable housing that may need renovation. They may need some additional new housing to accommodate the existing population. But we've also talked about inclusionary strategies, where you're dealing with an entirely different community. Often the inclusionary housing really requires developers who are not affordable housing developers. So you've got developers to educate as well as the citizens. And there's, frankly, I'm glad, I don't know if Izzy's still here, the council. Sometimes these issues are difficult if you're talking about changing the zoning regulations to allow more apartments in neighborhoods or in zoning categories that don't currently allow housing at all, let alone affordable housing. So my hope is, as was mentioned early on, that the work that's going into outreach and education will look at particularly the more, it's all challenging, but I think when you're talking about trying to bring more affordable housing into neighborhoods that don't have it and into zoning districts that don't have it, it triggers that fear factor. And it triggers not just citizens who don't really understand why their neighborhood should change, but there are a lot of developers who don't necessarily think that inclusionary housing is to their benefit. They would rather charge full market rates for as high as they can. When I was in Howard County, we adopted inclusionary housing requirements, and there are now inclusionary requirements in pretty much all of the zoning districts that are inside the equivalent of the URDL, including single family detached neighborhoods. And it just takes a little while for the development community to understand how that could work. So they're a big part of the audience. And I think because the development community has a lot of relationships with the council, if we can get that communication done well, then we have some hopes of getting regulations changed. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult with the council.
Hey,
Um,
Marsha, I'm still here. This is Izzy Patoka. It's good to
Hi.
see you. I missed a couple of meetings. There was some kind of disconnect on scheduling, and so I apologize to everyone for missing a couple of meetings, but your point is well taken that when we look at affordable housing, I don't think we should just view it as squeezing it into whatever inner beltway neighborhood we possibly can, but also to some of the areas that where we do have where that are prime for development. And I think to your point about how we look at affordable housing, I can recall not too long ago, we had some new development in the second district, and the illegal signs that were posted by the realtors to market those houses were marketing the school district. And so I think in terms of affordable housing, I think families that live in that would be residents of the units also deserve to have an opportunity to be in that very same school district that the realtors were trying to draw to the newest and shiniest development. And I think that we should work with all of our stakeholders, the development community certainly, the neighboring communities, and everybody that's involved in the development process. And maybe we should revisit the zoning code. That's a good point, Marcia.
Yeah, and Marcia, from the subcommittee perspective, I think from our conversations, I'd say we're in lockstep with what you laid out. I'm not as familiar with Dan and some of the others, but I've read through a lot of what Dr. T and others have done. And this idea of starting, Councilman, to your point, with what everybody believes is good and positive about where they are, and finding ways to discuss housing as part of a common victory, not something that's being forced, while at the same time making sure that there's a real effort put into having different voices at the table. And I think what I've read about the way the focus groups and other discussions get put together are meant to address our own implicit bias about who we think should be at the table or who we think doesn't agree with us. So I think we're very much with you on that.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to comment as well. That's why we feel like it's really important to have this broader engagement as a part of our recommendation. You'll see it does talk about engaging with the expert who will help us do that broader reach. And I'm sure Dr. T will do very similarly as she did in Howard County to reach out to all of the important voices and the various sectors, because in our discussion with our initial discussion with her about the work that we're seeking, she mentioned the same thing about having diverse voices at the table. She did say that to us, and that's what we really want. That's why our recommendation is to have this extensive outreach that helps us to develop what the messaging and a playbook, if you will, like Howard County had. And I don't know if the team mentioned it, but we do have a follow-up meeting with Dr. T to define the scope of work associated with helping us with our report. And then we will be working on a broader scope of work. So if I'm replicating what the team said already, I do apologize. But I got bumped out right at the start of your presentation, Terry. The gremlins are busy today.
Yeah, no, Stacy, I hadn't talked about the broader piece, just the potential for the communications work. So assisting the work group, I hadn't gone into. So you got that one.
Well, yeah. So we're asking, we're working with Dr. T to initially engage with us with the report itself, to help provide technical assistance there. Then this broader piece that we feel strongly that after our work as a work group ends, that we have a subset that continues to flesh out our broader endeavor, that of course would be led by Dr. T. That's who we're going to seek to do the work with us, given her experience and the outcomes in Howard County and elsewhere.
So, question for the subcommittee. In number 3, we talk about a toolkit. I just thought it might be helpful to flesh out a little bit what we mean by toolkit for developers on engaging with communities. So that's just a suggestion if we could expand on that a little bit. And I'm just also curious if there are any examples that are out there publicly that we could sort of link to or point to as areas where toolkits like this have been utilized successfully in other jurisdictions.
That is a very good question. I will defer. So this came up at the very end when we were putting the recommendations together, that we couldn't be so focused on the long-term piece. There were some questions from developer members about what can we rely on if we are trying to engage with community right now, or engage with the council or others, in the coming few weeks. So I'll toss this one back out there, either to members of the work group. We were going to make this part of our upcoming conversation with Dr. T to see what she knew was out there. But if anybody has some thoughts or suggestions, or along with that, if there are developers in this group that can articulate more about what they would like assistance with, or what would be important to them, I think that's all valuable.
Developer who's done a lot of work in Baltimore County can certainly say just the conversations that are going on now are extremely encouraging compared to where we have been with the county on a number of the other development proposals we pursued over the last decade that I've been doing this. The idea that the county takes a proactive approach in this is really, really welcome. That's the one thing I see has been a big missing element. And developers have kind of been on their own in this, especially in engagement with the communities. And really, whenever the county's involvement, they're strictly note takers or observers, but not really active participants. Putting out there that the county is very interested and would like to see this be successful, not to the detriment of the community, but having the realization that this is an overall improvement to the community and overall benefit to the county. So that whole shift is fantastic, and we look forward to moving forward with the county in this way. So that to me is the missing element. I mean, we have also had facilitators. We have one, I don't know if you've ever heard of Nicole Swearin. She's out of Canada. We actually brought her in for a very controversial deal. I don't know if people remember the one in Anne Arundel County a few years ago in Early Heights and Severna Park. That was my lovely deal that I had a great deal of consternation from at a 300-person community meeting, and when we asked how many people are here to support the development, there were only 5 hands that came up. So that'll give you the idea of what we were dealing with there. And again, no real support from the county or in any way, and that was a county at the time that had passed a workforce housing bill that said the exact thing that we were proposing was exactly what their bill was out there, and then they decided to instead of using their bill to the betterment, they decided to change the bill because they meant everywhere but Severna Park. So it was kind of an interesting thing. So I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I think just knowing that the county is going to be engaged with this and recognizes there's a problem and want to be part of the solution, that is 100% improvement from what we've seen in the past.
Appreciate that, Ned.
Yep.
Can I ask Ned, was that 100% affordable, or was it an inclusionary project where Severna Park might have an apartment project that was 10 or 15% affordable?
No, it was 100% affordable. It was a 9% tax credit development right on Ritchie Highway, that of course was interpreted as Ritchie Scenic Byway. I guess. And we met a little bit of resistance there because they thought it was a very bucolic rural setting with 150,000 ADT in front of our property, and there's no way the road could support the traffic from 84 apartments and the other issues. So it was all affordable, and you could go into the social media. I mean, the idea of how communities have also now used social media to engage in fighting development is amazing, and that was something that was meant to be. We hadn't even done anything at that point in time. We were just simply pursuing the tax credits, hadn't really gone down the entitlement path, and they got wind of it, and the rest was history. And once the social media engine started off, and of course they're communicating with like minds, not necessarily. I mean, there were people that are supportive of it, but they weren't intending to draw them out to the information section.
So thanks for those comments, Ned. And to your point, Terry, or I'm not sure which subcommittee this should live on, but I don't think that we had a specific recommendation on the county's role in supporting affordable housing or leading these conversations. And I wonder if we should have a specific recommendation sort of in line with the sentiment that Ned laid out there in terms of the county taking a proactive role in these discussions.
Sure, this is Steve. In fact, one of our recommendations is actually a policy statement that would make such a commitment, and a couple of our other recommendations get to that as well. More affirmatively and proactively being the lead as opposed to waiting for the development community to come to us.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Chair, I would suggest that we could also incorporate some of that type of language in the communication and education outreach recommendations as well. So it supports what Steve's subcommittee is stating as well. I think there's a way to wordsmith in language that supports our proactive effort, even from the communication standpoint.
This is Amy. I've been thinking about the vision statement and the policy and legal committee and this outreach and the idea of all these focus groups. And I'm struggling because on the one hand, tactically, this is always an issue in advocacy work, but it's like, do you put out there, this is what we believe, this is the opportunity to run it through some focus groups so that we find the language for that vision statement that dovetails most effectively with the broadest possible group of people, also seems like a really good opportunity to me as far as being able to come up with actually implementable strategies or things that like council people will pass and that kind of thing. So, but I feel like that's a tension as to which direction you go with that.
This is Chris Mudd. Was there any discussion in your group about having part of the strategy be inviting members of the community, or particularly skeptical members of the community, to tour existing facilities, whether they be in Baltimore County or elsewhere, so that you try and remove some of the fear by showing them what these places are and what they are not?
I
Do
think,
that.
yeah, no, I mean, it may, wait, sorry, Ned, what'd you say?
I said, we do that. In fact, I'm in the middle of one right now, the one I just noted you. I mean, I took some community members out to take tours of our facilities. We offer it up all the time. There's just if a community is accepting of that, that's great. Often they don't care. Whatever it is, it's not what it's going to be in their community. Whatever we're creating, can't possibly be an improvement. And so it really, there needs to be at least an open dialogue. A lot of these communities come in with a closed mind.
Yeah, and I'm not the expert on this, but what we were discussing again goes back to this idea of trying to find some common frames in the beginning. I think there's a lot we can layer on, touring things. I think you can create an overall environment where county officials are at these community meetings as well. I just heard talk about policy statements. I think that all contributes. But what I think has been lacking at a deep level is a mutually, trying to think of the word, not uplifting because it isn't for everyone, but just a mutual starting point of a dialogue around what this really is. And then you can layer on these other things. And I think what we haven't done is that hard work to create that dialogue and that communication narrative. But I think we can also add some other things into these recommendations that are more tactical or more strategic that would layer around and support this. But we focused on this core piece here. But I will make that note.
I think one of the things I like Amy's point about finding the right language in terms of what resonates. I think a lot of times people, they read not good stuff in the newspaper. The news is often awful, and the assumption is that these are going to be, I don't know, gangs and drug dealers, and it's bad people. And I think there's a way of trying to present. Some of these people are disabled, which makes it difficult for them to earn a lot of money. Some of them are older and they're not earning a lot of money. Some of them are hardworking people who happen to have a couple of kids, but they're not making much because the minimum wage is so low. But they may be people that are, doing your groceries in the grocery store or delivering something to you, or, I think somehow we need to do a better job of explaining who is going to benefit and why these are people that deserve to get some help, but that are not, going to be the kind of people that are going to be causing crime in the neighborhood. I mean, there's just a lot of misperception, and the point about it being fed on the media, you sometimes will see things from Nextdoor or Facebook about, oh, the cars were broken into, and there's a lot of misperceptions.
Yeah, dog whistles, sometimes we call that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just
Ms.
like
Martin,
those, I don't know if anybody saw this interesting article in the Post from Sunday about the Amazon Ring and how that things like that in and of themselves perpetuate racism, and there's somebody in the neighborhood who shouldn't be in the neighborhood and all that kind of stuff. So even discussing this in that way, it's like we're giving value or credence to that type of thinking, and I think we need to be really careful about that in these discussions. It's one thing to inform people and say this is what we're doing and this is what needs to happen because everybody needs a decent place to live. That's one thing. It's another thing to just go along with and act like to recognize these biases as though they're legitimate. And I think that we need to be careful about, when we're walking that line.
Great point. I think there was a case study, Leslie, in one of the playbooks that I'd been reading that Felipe had shared that got people talking about folks in their neighborhood that if you pulled them out of the homes they inherited or owned and put them in an affordable housing development, they'd consider them those people. But these are the folks that they would help out and see as neighbors because they were there and already part of their community. It's interesting when you play with frames and try to connect to what you already get beneath the bias. It sounds like complicated work, but it looks like they've been successful in other places.
Yeah, I think just to kind of go back to Amy's point, I think there will be a certain amount of just a judgment call on this, because obviously there are things we need to do now before the insight from these focus groups, and so we'll need to do the best we can, as best we can with that. And then, like Amy was saying, maybe there are things, do you do the vision statement before or after? There may be some things where it's just kind of a judgment call, whether we really need it now or whether it can wait. And so that'll just be kind of a tension, just given that this will take some amount of time.
Any additional comments or questions on this subcommittee? All right. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Felipe, and thanks to the rest of the subcommittee for your work on this. Much appreciated. I think we've got a good foundation here for moving forward.
Absolutely.
Welcome.
All right. Why don't we move to zoning and infrastructure?
Drew, I can't, my share button is also grayed out, so
We should be able to fix that.
Terry, you need to stop sharing.
Lisa's having some audio issues, but she can hear us, I believe. So she should be able to enable your sharing. Pete.
There you go, Pete. I backed off.
Okay, so what I'll start off with, sorry, we mostly focused on what's going to be legislative items. We sort of started off looking at some background information. I mean, some of the conversation was that any type of development can be subject to, will be included as affordable type of development. But there was a recognition that multifamily was sort of, a strength of getting more affordable units on the table. So we did a lot of background information looking at, land available for different types of zonings, different types of areas within the opportunity areas. There was a focus on the opportunity areas. We noticed a trend of how the county has started, was doing a lot of single family, but has it started to move just naturally through the years in 2020 to more multifamily types of units rather than single family attached. Then we started doing a review. I'm giving you sort of an overview of information that the group kind of discussed, analyzed, and came to why we're setting up the stage for what things need to be done to create more affordable housing in Baltimore County. So as we were also part of, it's not just zoning, it's also infrastructure. So we started looking at some of the adequate public facilities and basic services maps, requirements for developments as they go through the process, and what were some of the issues. So we found out that through the adequate public facilities for schools, there really wasn't a whole lot of impacts in opportunity areas for affordable housing based on the standards. So there was 3 high schools that are partially, some are completely like Towson, but others are only partially in an opportunity area. No middle schools, and I think there were 2 and a half elementary schools. Then we did look at the infrastructure for water and sewer and traffic. The notable thing here was that all the basically failing levels of intersection traffic sheds were in opportunity areas for affordable housing. That's this map right here, I'm sorry. So after looking at all that information, there was a little bit of focus of dealing with inside the URDL, inside the and the opportunity areas, recognizing that it's beyond just the opportunity areas in the VCA. But we did say that, part of our recommendations focused on, creating a clear definition of affordable housing in the zoning regulations with a range that included the voluntary compliance agreement, but looked beyond just the voluntary compliance agreement as well. There's a number of different ways in which you can define affordable housing, but it was, the group really felt like there needed to be a definition. Expansion into other zoning classifications was also, a recommendation from the group to include the ability to do it in commercial and industrial with the recognition. And I think Marcia mentioned this. I saw some of the comments coming in. As you can see, we're wordsmithing some of the information, clarifying and making sure that the recommendations are clear and giving concise direction for the larger work group. But so industrial is a slippery slope because not necessarily want that to be, but we wanted to keep the opportunities, if it was conducive for residential, that those districts could be included. And that they be permitted in all residential districts, regardless of the density allowed. Then, of course, one of the, as Drew, if you mentioned, one of the things, if it was a priority or low hanging or immediate actionable items would be, providing administrative approvals for affordable housing. A lot of these are done in tandem. It's all going to require legislation actions, but so I don't know what's necessarily, immediate or actionable items, but that quickly. But administrative approvals was one of the first things everybody talked about, and that is providing the section of the code where there are limited exemptions. I think I need to correct that section. That's a typo. For limited exemptions to allow them, as if the Baltimore County zoning regulations, there are limited exemptions. There's certain types of developments and certain types of criteria that allow for just an administrative process, no community input meeting, no hearing on those developments. They go through the process basically through agency reviews and gets approved that way. And that's what that recommendation is focused on. The next one is dealing with creating.
Pete, on that one, did you discuss, or is anyone aware of other jurisdictions that create, similar administrative approvals for affordable housing projects?
I am not aware of that. I'm not aware of any jurisdiction. They're treated all the same. I mean, as we get into it, there are different criteria for that, but they've never changed the process specifically for affordable housing that I'm aware of. Does anybody else know from my work group?
I don't know.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that one of the things is that there's other jurisdictions who have much larger areas of land that are multifamily use of right. So one of the reasons that this is an option here is because there's no land left that's multifamily use of right. That we can look at other jurisdictions to see what they have.
I don't know either in terms of other jurisdictions. I think that trying to provide some kind of expedited process is useful. My biggest concern is that the way the limited exemption is now, not to have a community input meeting is just going to fan the flames of people who feel like something bad is happening. And as we talked about on public engagement under the recommendations for Terry's group, trying to be as open and transparent as possible is probably going to fly better than trying to hide it and not allow a community input meeting. But there may be a variation on how you can expedite without necessarily cutting out the community input.
Totally agree. I've talked about that for a while in Baltimore County for a number of different things.
In a way, the real issue is having, it's one thing to have just a community meeting where people can come and make their comments. It's another thing where people can, file an appeal to the Board of Appeals when they're not a party to the development and they don't live anywhere near it and they actually have no impact whatsoever. So yeah, I'm sure it would be helpful, but the way I read it, even under the limited exemption, you still have appeals to the Board of Appeals. So I have comments, a whole Board of Appeals section comment, but I can wait till we get. I added some more comments this morning, but I don't think they made it in.
Not yet, Leslie. I was going to let you bring your stuff up. Yeah, I haven't had, I just got this morning.
It was just this morning. I know.
So this is as of last Friday, okay? That I have. That's what these track changes are. So the next.
Could I just? I agree with Marsha. Can I add something?
Yeah, go for it, Klaus.
So I agree with Marsha. I think fundamentally, every time we come on a topic where we want to incentivize something and then we look at the somewhat convoluted development regulations in the county and then we say we cut something out, we should recognize that that's an unhealthy thing. Most of those regulations are there for a reason. And if that is unwieldy and unfavorable to development sometimes, then it should be changed wholesale. We should not go and raise and pick and say, no, we can cut something out to the detriment of transparency or whatever, or to the detriment of public facilities or whatever. That's a dangerous approach. So I would warn to do that, because we want to incentivize affordable housing, but we should not do it by cutting something out of the regulations without reforming them really sort of comprehensively.
Just to put an exclamation point on what Klaus just said and also what Marcia said, I can tell you that I took a real beating recently on a limited exemption where everybody was happy. But it was the process that people were concerned about. And even though you're doing the right thing, cutting out that community input meeting is really difficult. Is really difficult for the community to accept in terms of transparency, because all the nearby, in the incident in the bill I'm talking about, all the nearby stakeholders were very, very pleased with what was going on. And I don't want to bring it back up because I think it's behind us, but I think it is a little dangerous to move in that direction.
You had asked about other jurisdictions as well. And I brought up Anne Arundel County in our committee, and I know someone went out and researched it. And I actually referenced the workforce housing bill and the deal that I was trying to do in Severna Park that met the bill, and what happened to generate the opposition, that council was in place went back and retracted elements of the bill. But since it has been, the latest council came back and restored all the original components to it. The way that bill worked was it's not a limited exemption, but they were giving affordable housing developments that met certain criteria and definitions, which mostly were related to the low-income housing tax credit program, if you read the language. But they were taking zoning designations basically from 1 unit for every, or 2 units per acre up to 10 units per acre, which is their R2 through R10 zones, as well as some commercial districts, and said if you're doing affordable housing that meets these definitions, you can take your density up to an R22, which is 22 units per acre. So that didn't necessarily exempt people from the development process for affordable housing. And actually in the last round, 8 projects pursued for affordable housing, low-income housing tax credits in Anne Arundel County the last round, because this legislation was restored. But the idea is that you still have the full development process, but instead of eliminating the process, they're now giving that density, and so it becomes a matter of right development with a special exception if it gets through the special exception process. So it gives a shortcut way to get that density that's necessary, but it didn't eliminate the development process entirely.
Right, and that's another way to go about it. And I think that Pete did mention, I think it's in here in this tiny little print, about having zoning affordable housing as a matter of right in all residential zones, which I think is similar. And of course it could be in terms of density and all that, that could be more specific, more specified in some way. I mean, I think that some regulations and rules and things are there for a reason, and others have just been there for generations and have basically put Baltimore County where it is. And so some of it's intentional. So not all regulations are good, positive regulations, which is why there's a VCA in Baltimore County.
Okay.
I'm not sure limited exemptions exempted development from all development requirements. It just shortens the cycle a little bit. And actually, limited exemptions in Baltimore County, community can come out to those limited exemption meetings, correct? I mean, it's just not necessarily brought to their community.
Correct. There is a development review committee meeting that's held. Yes.
And that is a public forum, but it's housing.
Right. But to Marcia's and Councilman Patoka's point, I think there's a way that you could do, some of this in tandem and still provide that avenue for transparency. So, but that's going to require, I thought about that, but the work group was focused on adding this to an administrative process. So, but there's a way that we can tweak this and talk about maybe making an administrative approval, but still providing that transparency for the community to have their their say, just as Councilman Patoka mentioned, they're for the project, but they would like to have known about it up front. Sometimes it's just letting them, aware of what's going on without them getting blindsided in some points. But that being said, like I said, we're still tweaking and working through some of the logistics of even the definition of affordable housing is in tandem to, creating an administrative approval. So there are details to that needs to be worked out. Is it 60%? Is it 80%? Is it 60% for, certain projects? There's a component of, how much can be mixed income, there's a lot of those details that I know Drew's looking for specifics, but some of that can be a range of how you actually define affordable housing, and then how you actually allow for an administrative approval to move forward. There's a lot of flexibility in how you craft the legislation, I guess, but this is the direction the group was going in order to provide an easier path for to gain the ability to create affordable housing units, if that helps any. Shall I move on? Continue, Drew? Or?
Yep, just a general comment. So on some of those recommendations that are somewhat open, like defining affordable housing, if we're not making a recommendation on what that definition should be in this report, perhaps we can say a little bit about how the subcommittee recommends that decision be made, or who needs to be a part of that conversation.
I have a comment about that.
Yeah.
Because to be honest, I'm not sure why it keeps coming up. I guess it's because these recommendations are supposed to go beyond the VCA. But I think that we have clarified that in terms of any advantage that a developer might get for building affordable housing, such as, I think it's further down where you would get some bonuses or some waiver of, waiver modifications, whatever, just some type of advantage, that it would have to first be between 30 and 60% AMI until the VCA is still the county's in full compliance with the VCA, before somebody who was building 80% would get any benefits. So that's how I conceptualize it, that it would be affordable housing is 30% to 60% AMI as defined in the VCA, because it is defined in the VCA. And then once the county has complied completely and completely satisfied the VCA, then it could go up to 80% AMI. But anyone building above 80% would not be building affordable housing, and should not be getting any type of benefits that are being offered to developers who are building affordable housing. So that is my perspective on it.
I would be really, really careful there, because as an affordable housing developer, I mean, we're trying to meet the VCA, the county, but we're also trying to bring in the resources that make it necessary to do this housing. And the resources aren't all coming from the county. They're coming from low-income housing tax credit programs. They're coming from state programs. They're coming from federal programs that all have different criteria and different things attached to them. If you do it so narrow that you can't, like as of right now, the low-income housing tax credit program will allow up to 80% AMI. You can still generate tax credits on those units, which is equity that goes into these deals, right, and it's necessary to make them happen. And by putting those in, you still have to meet 60% on average on it, but it can be beneficial to the development to generate additional resources to make it happen. So I think the idea of garnering this definition is really important, to make sure that you're thinking about all the resources that need to go into these and not restricting yourself just by the county's definition alone.
Right, and it can be 60% on average then, if that's.
Yeah, like I said, it's a matter of making sure that you're not excluding
I hear you.
Other resources.
So what I'm saying is, yes, it can be, then you can say it's affordable if it's 60%. If you're building, 35 units and the average is 60% AMI, so that's the type of detail that that we can talk about, but not just someone coming in and building, initially coming in and building 80% AMI and then trying to get the benefit when the VCA hasn't been complied with. I think there's a difference
Yeah, I
between
just
your
think it's a longer
averaging out.
discussion.
Well, I'm sure this is our first time presenting all this stuff, so I'm sure it is a longer discussion.
I think it's a longer discussion too, and maybe we could take that all up with Pete and the committee. I tend to think that if we wait until we've met the voluntary compliance obligations, we lose a lot of time because that's going to take time. I think if we're trying to improve affordability, both in existing communities and in older opportunity areas, I think we need as many tools as possible. And I guess I hate to put off doing some higher level of affordability until we've met the consent decree requirements. I think we won't resolve this today, but I think there are a variety of incentives and we need to be a little flexible.
Yeah, and I think the problem is, and I know, Marsha, you were locked out of like all of those meetings, but we're in the 5th or 6th year of the VCA and the county is way behind. And so HUD and the plaintiffs are getting a little anxious and they might be looking at wanting to take some enforceability action. So I think you need to really know what you're looking at when you're, there's not just one, it's not just, oh, we want to be, create a whole bunch of affordable housing of all different levels. That's great. And I'm in favor of that. But, this committee, even though sometimes people are now denying it, but this workshop and the subcommittees were created because the county is way out of compliance with the VCA, which is why I keep talking about it. So that's, just to make sure everybody's aware of that. Very, very out of compliance at this point for hard units, especially.
And I don't deny that that's a high priority. I'm just suggesting that may be the shorter term priority, but I don't think we ought to put everything off for another 10 years if it takes us that long to meet the VCA.
It's hopefully the county has some plans of acquiring some land for hard units in the next year or two so that won't happen.
So folks, I don't want to take us too far down a rabbit hole. But just because, Leslie, you put it out there, I gotta say, number one, it's not about denying, but it is absolutely unequivocal that the county executive moved to do this work group so that the county was in a good position around affordable housing in general. It was not a response to the VCA.
Yeah, right.
But two, we've been very clear with HUD, we want to do better. We want to get more hard units, but interim goals on hard units are not a compliance issue. Interim goals are not the same as out of compliance with the VCA. So while we have work to do, when we start saying the county's out of compliance, I just want to be really clear that language is important.
Okay. And the reason that I keep bringing up the VCA in terms of the work group is because in the analysis of barriers, the work group is like the first thing that keeps being cited as this kind of panacea. So in my view, because of that, I connect this work group to the VCA.
Gotcha. And we do see this as of huge importance. I agree with you there.
Right. And I have to weigh in because we've had these discussions on the VCA, just ongoing work group. And in that this is a public meeting, we do have to go back to this because if you read the reason, the CE statement for this work group is to get the broader vision for affordable housing in Baltimore County. And as a result of this work, our goal is to continue to aggressively move toward compliance. So while we highly respect your input, we highly respect the work that we do together, Leslie, but for just clarification, this was about the broader picture, and he said that to us in our meeting, that it's about the broader picture, but clearly our eye is laser focused on compliance. So I have to say that again, publicly, that this is recorded and this is a public meeting.
Okay, moving on to the rest of the recommendations. now that everybody's got a taste of how some of our subcommittee meetings are going. It's obviously the devils are the details a lot of times, but it was getting to a conclusion of what those details drew about where it's 80, 60, 30, you know, that kind of stuff we weren't getting there in terms of total agreement. So that's why we kind of worded that the way it's been worded, but we can definitely work on that at the next committee meeting. The other recommendation is looking at the impediments to development generated from the basic services maps in one or more ways. We talked about exempting affordable housing from the basic services maps. I know what Klaus you just said, but keep in mind a lot of times the basic services maps, and I think the administration, Stacy and Drew, have heard me say that they're sort of outdated because adequate public facilities and the development regulations still require the developments to do a test to see that the basic water and sewer systems are sufficient and have capacity regardless of the basic services map, as do we require a traffic study. So there is another mechanism, or if you will, you know, gate that it has to go through to make sure that those things are being addressed before any kind of development go forward outside of the basic services maps. But the basic services maps is sort of a catch-all. It's not, you know, you can't move forward without an exemption or a waiver. Then the idea of prioritizing where there are deficiencies identified in the basic services maps, that we prioritize them in the capital improvement program. Then we also include the idea of amending for inclusionary zoning, as Marcia and I think Leslie have stated already, that the group is recommending that we create a provision in the code for inclusionary zoning. In tandem to that, we talk about incentivizing, if that's a word, affordable housing through other types of processes. It could be part of the inclusionary zoning. I think Marcia has great examples, what she did in Howard County of, I call them tolerances, but it's like density bonuses along with modifications to the setbacks and height regulations. It's really it's a sliding scale. So if you're going to build, if you want to, you know, do 3 stories or 4 stories, as long as you meet a certain setback, you can go up that high. So, and you grant these for, you know, you grant these exceptions or modifications and sliding scale abilities to get that, you know, to increase your density, if you will, on specific properties for these types of developments for affordable housing, giving them an incentive as well as requiring it as part of the development process. And there's you know, again, we could go into a lot of different specifics, but there's a whole host of different ways in which you can provide these modifications to it and the criteria associated with it. And then of course, prohibiting any new single family zoning in Baltimore County within the URDL. This is trying to limit the ability to, you know, as we said, there's issues associated with not having enough inventory for townhouse or multifamily types of developments. So if we eliminate the ability to downzone property to single family zoning, even though we know single family zone, there's a lot of properties that are zoned that way, and the ability to provide single family zoning, we're not eliminating affordable housing with single family properties. We're just, you know, creating more opportunities within the URDL. That's sort of that recommendation. That's the report. And I'll open it up.
I could just throw in a quick add-on to this point that you have in the recommendation, that when there are insufficient public facilities, that then those improvements would be added to the capital improvement plan. I mean, as long as where we are today is that development is held hostage to these APFOs because these investments are not made, and year in, year out, everybody can come out and say, well, here's the traffic problem, here's the sewer problem, there's this problem, and therefore we don't want the development, and then we won't make any progress. So we really have to get out of this and basically make these facilities adequate so that doesn't happen any further.
Leslie, I don't know if you wanted to.
I just had something about the Board of Appeals to add, if that's okay.
Yeah, I didn't know if you want to share your document or you wanted me to.
Oh, I have it on a different computer. So do you have mine?
Yeah, I have it.
I'm looking at my laptop while I'm on my work laptop.
Give me a second. Tell me where you want to start. Just go down to the bottom.
I think down to the bottom, yeah. So the last meeting that we had, we were talking about the last subcommittee meeting, sorry. We were talking about the Board of Appeals and how, just like with Red Maple, you know, the Board of Appeals has a lot of influence, and the fact that in Baltimore County, the Board of Appeals is a little bit potentially politicized because an individual council member chooses a Board of Appeals member from that council member's own district. What someone, I think Chris Mudd thought, but this is not in the code because I didn't find it, and it's certainly not in the charter, is that 3 Board of Appeals members meet and they're not supposed to be in their jurisdiction. So they're not supposed to be biased, but I don't see that in the code. So that should be in the code, you know, that they cannot, that anyone, the Board of Appeals members who are making the decisions cannot be making the decisions about their own jurisdiction, or it should be, anyway, that would be a recommendation. Because even if we do the limited exemption that Pete was talking about, that doesn't bypass the Board of Appeals. It bypasses the hearing examiner, but not the Board of Appeals. So somebody could still, because it's like Title II Title II is exempt, but not Title IIA. Anyway, so they could still go to the Board of Appeals. And the other thing is, the standard of who can apply. I'm sorry, who can appeal. So currently the Board of Appeals, and that's in section 32.4.281. If someone is feeling aggrieved, then they can appeal to the Board of Appeals. So you're not just an aggrieved, I mean, it's not standing in any regular sense of, you know, it's somebody who, a plaintiff filing a case in court, this standing is almost anybody can feel aggrieved. And then they have these really extensive definitions of who is a community association, even if they're not incorporated. So if the Board of Appeals is going to still be involved in the development in this county, then that's going to need to be addressed, because as we know, that's a real barrier. I think the county lost like 56 hard units with Red Maple. Even if they eventually come back, it's not going to be for a long time. So anyway, so that's the primary thing. I think everything else is covered. And as far as, just to touch on briefly what we were talking about before, when Ned piped up with the definition of affordable housing, we actually we weren't quite as engaged in our discussions in the actual subcommittee. And sometimes, like if I know that Ned brought up the Anne Arundel County legislation because I sent it out to some group, after that meeting. But people who know in detail can present that, to subcommittee, like Ned, like members of the subcommittee, and say, well, this is what happens if you do this, so that we can actually formulate it in a way that, incentivizes affordable housing and maybe gives some benefits, but it doesn't, and it it satisfies or kind of moves the VCA forward while also not, creating barriers for developers to, use tax credits or whatever, which is encouraged, where we've been encouraging, everybody's encouraging the county to use tax credits. So we certainly don't want to create a problem for that. So anyway, I think that's all I have right now. Thanks.
Okay. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on the zoning and infrastructure draft recommendations that are here?
Pete, let me ask, did you all talk about PUDs at all?
Not really. I mean, it was mostly spoken about the development process and how administrative approvals would be addressed. And PUDs really didn't come into the process because that's more of extensive community input process.
Okay, thanks.
We brought up that as someone who's done multiple developments in Baltimore County, that are affordable, they all required PUDs. So what we're trying to do is trying to find a way that we didn't necessarily have to go down that path. So
Right.
We weren't trying to reform the PUD process.
Just a couple of questions, Pete. In the second recommendation, the second bullet point, we talk about the ability to allow multifamily in commercial and industrial zoning districts. Looks like those are identified in Table A. I'm not entirely sure what Table A is, but I think it might be helpful to maybe have a map of those areas in the final report.
That would be good.
Now,
It's Exhibit F, Table A, Exhibit F to the VCA.
Yeah, sorry. That's referring to the VCA. That's referring to specifically expanding it in not just those zoning classifications, but those zoning classifications within those opportunity areas as defined in the VCA. So, I mean, if we're focused on the VCA or not focused on the VCA, we can remove that. We just need to expand, and I can identify the zoning classifications if that's what you're talking about. And we could get a map. But I think what more importantly is to identify what those zoning classifications are. I thought about that afterwards, but
yeah, for that, I mean, I think it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant whether it's linked to the VCA or not. I think for purposes of clarity, I think we should just have that table or have that map directly within our report.
Mr. Chair, I just also want to say that our actions are designed to help with our compliance with the VCA. So I think where appropriate, certain things related to the VCA should indeed be included, because overall effort is to move our global affordable housing agenda forward, which is going to help us, invariably comply. So I do believe that the reference and the table and everything related to the VCA, because they're intertwined.
Yes, agreed, Madam Mayo.
Mr. Chair, may I add a comment?
Yeah, what's open?
So regarding the commercial and the industrial areas, because we did have that discussion, it would only be if they were, like I think Patrick Stewart, I think it was, said, so industrial, like Hunt Valley, there's industrial areas that are still decent areas. So we're not talking about putting people in some, far off industrial, because anyway, so I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks. Same with commercial.
Yep, understood. And that's exactly the reason why I thought it'd be helpful to have the map.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Very good. Thanks.
And my last comment is on the second to last bullet, where we talk about a density bonus. It might be helpful just for our readers who are going to be members of the public looking at this to just expand a little bit on what we mean by that, and how that is helpful in incentivizing the creation of affordable units.
If I could make a comment on this industrial commercial, I mean, those areas are, there are too many. That's overzoned and there's not enough demand for this. So there are a lot of those that are underutilized. And our development process is such that you can do this only every 4 years. It can be rezoned, and if there's nobody applying for it, then it's not going to happen. In our master plan, and this goes to the new master plan, and the linkage to affordable housing isn't really intentional. Also, there are the community enhancement areas and the revitalization areas. These were not really used to use rezoning in a intentional way. And so then it always comes to the PUDs. And so the question of where we can move the needle on affordable housing is really closely tied to all these other issues like APOs and rezoning process and PUDs and how we do the master plan so that we have actual actionable rezoning happening in the map derived from the master plan and not just from applicants that want to avoid something.
Good point.
I also comment on the additional density is, as the zoning code in Baltimore County, the highest density other than some of the MXT or whatever, the downtown Towson district, things like that. The highest density is 16 units per acre. And I can just tell you, multifamily product of garden style is probably in the area of 20 to 25 units per acre on average. If you start getting into 4-story product or 4-story elevator product, that's in the 30 to 35 per unit. These designations don't even exist in Baltimore County. So just to be able to have something that's more reasonable to work with in any of these zones would be beneficial to create the type of products that are traditionally associated with affordable housing.
Yeah, that's helpful, and that's the type of additional context that I think would be helpful to the readers here. So thank you for that. Okay. So if there are no further comments for the Zoning and Infrastructure Committee, I would like to move to the Best Practices Committee so that we don't short them on time. We've got about 30 minutes remaining.
So Pete, you'll have to stop sharing because there we go. All right.
I thought I had.
You did. Thanks. So our work group, first of all, I want to say, it's sort of backing up to a question that Drew posed earlier, that our work group really did look at how the county should take a much more affirmative and direct role. It was said that we ought to sort of flip the script, that unless we start taking the lead instead of allowing us to sort of sit and wait for people to come to us, developers, and then engage in discussions, that we're really not going to advance the overall goal of expanding the housing. One of the first things we did talk about was the need to send a clear message about that. That was Derek's comment, which I think echoes Terry's work group. But then it's also that we don't have a policy statement regarding the county's commitment to affordable housing. So thanks to Jim Kraft, who started this, Jim French, who started crafting a statement. we would propose a statement that talks about not only preserving stable and affordable housing, but promoting economic mobility and opportunity as an intentional strategy to dismantle social and racial inequalities. We debated this. The sense was that if we're going to achieve equity and equality in the future, we have to recognize the past injustices that the county that's been experienced in the building of affordable units, so that a statement actually would encompass the language that we have here. This was, I think, robustly discussed. I really appreciated the thoughtful comments that came out of subcommittee members. We also recognize that the county already has a fair housing action plan that's been established, and in fact leads a lot of the actions that the county has already started to undertake. So you'll see in brackets reference to the plan itself as an acknowledgement that it has to be woven into our overall recommendations and not basically put aside as a separate document, but really intertwined with our overall goals and how we're going to start to achieve the outcomes of that document is also laid out, and to which the county has already not only helped develop, but also to which it's committed. So we initially had a different structure for presenting this information. I want to thank Klaus for suggesting a different format so that we could sort of present these maybe in a little more cohesive way. I will say that while we had a really great set of conversations, perhaps unlike the other groups, we only had one representative of the development community on the work group, and so we leaned on Jim French a lot. But certainly there may be some different opinions even amongst the development community about these. So we really thought the recommendations fall into three different areas: more affordable housing projects in opportunity areas, investing in older communities where affordable housing is present but needs to be addressed to improve opportunities, and then also investing in a way that we avoid losing product, losing buildings, losing affordable housing to becoming market rate or declining and become substandard. So under the first category, actually probably B should have probably been A, which was to say that we now have a new Department of Housing and Community Development, and it needs to be assertive in initiating the development of new housing units and preserving the units that exist. And I know that Terry and his team are looking to bring in someone to help basically take on that responsibility. Also to explore how capital funding, and this maybe dovetail with some of Pete's suggestions, but also when developments are occurring, is there a way for our capital investments to be utilized to support, perhaps in a P3 context, the build out of public infrastructure, roadways, sewer and water, and or to help support demolition of property that would then encourage the redevelopment for affordable units. The state has a housing needs assessment, but we've not really done a full assessment. And if we're going to do a longer term strategic plan, we need to have a better understanding perhaps of the units that are in place and what else we need to construct. Again, looking to the Fair Housing Action Plan, we have to make sure that we have enough units that are below the 80% AMI. And maybe this goes to the definitional issue that we discussed just a few moments ago, or maybe it's at least recognizing that even at 80% AMI, we don't have enough units that are affordable. We talked a lot about how the county's property, the county's land may be able to be made available. Jen Meacham had previously done an analysis of some properties and this has been a discussion in the VCA context as well, is what kind of county land may be available to provide 4 units without defining exactly the size. I think previous indications that we probably need at least 6 to 10 acres, which may really limit what the county can provide. But then the county should begin to look at land it could purchase for development in order again to partner with, not necessarily to do the construction or the development itself, but to perhaps partner with developers, either for-profit or nonprofit developers who are looking for that opportunity. Towson University, for instance, has residential housing, but it's on university-owned land, and they have long-term leases with a developer to have built the student housing. So that may be a model that can be utilized. We also talked a lot about, and I think this was something Stacy Spann raised when we heard from him, is the need to build out our partnerships, whether it's with land banks like Chesapeake Habitat or community development organizations such as what Amy Menser does, the lending community, and seeing how they can be even more valuable in helping us move the construction forward. We've talked about hosting a developers roundtable to identify any impediments and new strategies that may not be considered here in this work group. And I know that perhaps a year and a half ago, there was a roundtable. It was more to help educate developers about the opportunities in the county. Of course, that was immediately before the pandemic struck. But perhaps we need to re-engage more developers than have been able to participate in this work group and see what other ideas we may not have actually discussed yet. So the idea of investing in existing communities really goes outside of the opportunity areas. You know, what are we doing to ensure that we're preserving or perhaps enhancing the housing stock in the communities that now exist within the county? And we had a number of people raise this as a concern, that we not just focus on the opportunity areas, but also communities that exist, but yet and would not be considered opportunity areas. 3 areas that were mentioned were Essex, which comports with one of the county executives' initiatives to look holistically at how do we enhance and strengthen the Essex community. Lansdowne in the Southwest, an area that's becoming increasingly a community of an area of color and people whose incomes are still not robust. And Dundalk, where we also have a community development organization that could be a partner. Echoing what Melody had said, you need a place-based strategy to do this, to undertake it, which means a community profile would have to be undertaken in order to assess the specific housing needs, whether it's rehab, home ownership increase, perhaps bringing in, oops, sorry for the typo, bringing in the neglected property revolving loan fund that PAI will be administering as another tool to help get us there. And then lastly, in this bucket at least, is that we look at how do we strengthen and create incentives to support housing. We've talked about basically increasing the pot of the gap financing funds that exist. The county executive has remained committed to providing capital funds consistent with the amounts that the VCA, that were provided under the VCA, but it may not quite be enough. We talked a number of times about how do we use the housing choice voucher to actually stimulate more investment, and whether our payment standards should go up to 130% in the opportunity areas. Marcia Parham Green's indicated we're at the 120% now, and that they're undertaking a review and an assessment about whether the 130% is an achievable number. This again could further incentivize or encourage developers to participate in the program and serve the voucher holders that are Baltimore County residents. Also, again, the idea of how do you reduce costs by increasing energy efficiencies. So it not only reduces the overall project cost, but then reduces the longer term utility expenses of the residents in order to keep them from having to either go without heat or electricity, heat or air conditioning, or then to have to trade off the expenses of paying for some other things that they have. We also think that the actions really fall into two different categories: financial programs and incentives, and then governance actions. One is to examine whether we should be administering our own bond allocation from the state or allow the state to continue to administer it. None of us are bond counsel, so unable to really determine if that is economically to the betterment of the county or if the cost of the county outweighs the value, since we still have the bond allocation available. Secondly, would be annual request for proposal for the project-based vouchers to encourage more of the development community or the existing residential providers, multifamily housing, to accept vouchers. Discussion about a pre-development fund and how that could assist particularly smaller, less well-financed developers to gain access to capital and be able then, of course, to still be able to demonstrate they could obtain the permanent financing that was necessary. But in order to encourage at least some of those upfront costs or enable the upfront costs to be covered in a way that right now could be a hindrance to many of the smaller developers particularly. We talked about both reserving and or acquiring units in existing multifamily housing developments. And this would be an extended period of years in order to make sure that within some of the multifamily housing properties that exist, that the voucher holders that the county is supporting could make sure they live in opportunity areas where you do have those choices. That would take work, of course, with the Multifamily Housing Association. And I know that Terry's begun some good work to build some bridges there that might be an opportunity for us. Perhaps one of the recommendations that caused, I think, some of the most interest, and maybe it's contradictory to the fact we just created a new department, is actually to create a quasi-governmental housing authority that has its own separate bonding authority. So has the bonding authority based upon the county's bond rating, but actually would be independent of the county government, be able to function separately and to actually engage in the transactions outside of the county government. Other jurisdictions obviously have public housing authorities that are able to function in a very efficient and effective way without the same often constraints that the county governments have. We talked about, but we didn't go down as deeply as Pete's group did on the inclusionary zoning policy. We recognize it needs to be further vetted to determine really, which zones that may apply, what are the proper incentives, are there different housing types that should be considered, is it greater density bonuses, is it something else that actually might stimulate inclusionary zoning. Again, from the Fair Housing Action Plan was the need to provide more housing opportunities and options for people with disabilities. And similarly, although most of our focus has been upon the rental market, the Fair Housing Action Plan also talks about looking at mortgage loan denials and the high cost of lending that has disproportionately affected people of color and other minorities as they've tried to get loans in order to purchase homes. The county does have a development guide that's currently provided for those who are interested in engaging in the county's development process, getting support from the county and working with us. And there was concern it needed to be updated, make it clear as to what the pre-development process is. Again, I want to give Pete a shout out because he sort of created a structure around which, as we deal with developers coming to us, there's certain things that we need to do and they need to provide before we go too far down the pathway. So it was expressed that this needs to be very clear and that our housing goals are clearly articulated in this development guide. The last three are similar to what was described up above: an inventory of the land that could be potentially made available, collaborating with other organizations and creating new partnerships. And then lastly, again, hosting the developers roundtable that were all part of the governance aspects that we thought need to be addressed. So happy to expand on anything or to answer any questions.
There's a lot here, Steve, so thank you to you and your subcommittee for the work on this. Floor is open for comments or questions.
Hey, Steve, just so because you mentioned it, want to let everybody know that the Deputy Director for DHCD position, which is heavily weighted towards affordable housing and housing finance, has been posted. And we've gotten a few applications, but we want to get a bunch more. So I will send out a link to that to everyone on the work group, and please spread word of that around if you know qualified folks.
Great. I should have actually, Drew, just asked if any of the other subcommittee members who really helped develop this, if they have anything they want to add on any aspects of this.
Hey, Steve, it's Jim French here. I just wanted to sort of clarify that the recommendations around providing additional gap financing and the project-based housing voucher step-up proposal, I mean, those would be equally, relevant for new construction, as well as, preservation projects that were aimed at renovating older housing stock or maintaining affordability that where there was a risk of conversion to market rate. So just wanted to point that out, that those two bullets could, weren't necessarily, meant to only deal with preservation.
Good point, Jim. Thank you. I know it is a lot to absorb.
Just more of a comment, but we've had really each of the subcommittees touch on inclusionary zoning, and so I think we will need to figure out the most appropriate place to capture that within kind of the combined report. But it seems like there are a lot of details that need to be figured out in terms of what inclusionary zoning legislation in Baltimore County might look like. I think it might be helpful for the subcommittees to get together, not to recommend exactly how it should be done, but to expand in a little bit more detail on the factors that need to be thought through and considered as we move into the potential introduction of legislation on that. You went through a couple things in your comments, Steve.
And that's why we just said study, because the factors and parameters were still, well, we just didn't dive deeply enough into identifying those particulars. And there was an analysis that was done back in 2019 by planning department staff that can also be of help, provide some very valuable background as we continue to talk about this.
In principle, the inclusionary housing part has probably the highest acceptance in the population because it's the most invisible. It's not a concentrated amount of affordable housing. It's not about an affordable housing project, but it's in seeding affordable housing into any project of a certain size. So in that sense, it's sort of easy. But then the hard part, and Marcia alluded to that earlier, is that now you are confronting developers that are not used to that with an affordable component. And the scattered affordable housing that you get that way, of course, has its own management issues and has access issues and all of those things that various committees have already discussed also. So it's definitely not an easy thing to do, but I think it would hold a lot of promise if we do it right. So we have to learn from the other jurisdictions because in many cases they have put this in their zoning law and then they fail to actually have it and implement it. So we need to learn from everybody how to do it so that it actually happens.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm on a Baltimore City group like this one that's looking at its inclusionary housing law, which hasn't generated many units at all, and they've hired a consultant to help them do some analysis. And actually, that I think that could be it could be useful to do something like that. I've also we've done a couple of forums at the Baltimore Metropolitan Council to kind of get information out about this, and Art Rogers in Washington, D.C. participated in one of those, and I just touched base with him now that the city is going through this as well. And he explained to me more like about the analysis that they went through. So it does sound to me like it's useful to have some development expertise to be able to understand the finances because you're really trying to leverage the strength of your market relative to the zoning that you have right now, to look at what will fly financially for developers, so that it'll actually happen. And so I think there are jurisdictions to look for. Howard County is sort of an alternate example where they just required it, and there was no density bonus or anything like that. So you've got a few different and I think that maybe you can do that in a very hot market. I mean, it seems to have worked in Howard County. So there are different models right here in the Washington, the Maryland, D.C. area that you can look at. But I think that Baltimore City is sort of an example of where you really, it's sort of a cautionary tale where you really want to have an analysis that shows you how this could work before implementing something.
This is one for all of the subcommittees, really, and we've touched on it a few times today, but we have not gotten into it in much detail. And this is where I think some of the expertise of the developers that we have on the work group might be helpful as well. But on financing, we've talked about financing a number of times, but don't have too much specific captured within the draft recommendations. I think it will be important in the final product to at least identify what is in the toolkit for financing projects and what else we should be considering, either through outside funding sources or by adding through the county budget process somehow.
Okay. So hearing all the different subcommittee reports makes me think that we need to somehow have an umbrella over top of this to make sure we have also the comprehensive outlook as to what we're really trying to achieve, other than have more affordable housing. I have said this many times, it's not about housing, it's about community. And so I'm suggesting that we would have somewhere a paragraph over top of this whole thing that describes sort of the ideal outcome that we want to see, which is mixed income, mixed use communities that are not as homogeneic as they are today, where they are income stratified and totally use stratified. So that's why I keep on talking about the commercial and industrial areas that are overzoned, where we could place these new comprehensive developments. So I think at the end of the day, none of us will be happy if we are just getting projects and just more housing, even if it is affordable, if it is not really in this context of quality of life and high quality of life and the modern lifestyle that has the amenities, that has good schools, that has good open spaces, has good access, walkability, transit, you know, all the things that people want to see in a community. It all has to come together. And I'm afraid that if we don't say that somewhere, that's what we're striving for, and I'm assuming that we are, maybe we need to have a discussion about that, that would get lost in the weeds otherwise.
I think it's a great comment, Klaus, and I would, you know, I think that is what most members of the work group are trying to achieve through this process, and would, you know, there's a little bit that's contained, a little bit of that's contained in the policy statement that's on the screen here. But I agree, you know, something on top of all of this that ties back to the purpose that this work group was created would be helpful, and we can certainly work on that, and would welcome you know, your assistance and your input on that as it's developed. So we have 4 minutes remaining. Are there any additional thoughts, comments, questions before we conclude? Okay. I'm also not seeing any questions in the chat from any members of the public that were listening in today. So I think that, you know, there are a couple takeaways from today's discussion that I think the subcommittee chairs, their co-chairs, and their committee members will need to work on and further refine a little bit. So that's something that we can work on following this meeting. You know, once we're able to make any additions or changes based on today's discussion, I think I would recommend that these recommendations be circulated to the work group for further review. Meanwhile, you know, our internal team will work to combine these documents into a more cohesive work product that will include some of the kind of context and you know, orienting statements similar to what Klaus just described. So we'll be working on that, and hopefully be in a position to have something along those lines to look at our October meeting. And then following that, hopefully have something that we can post for public comment as well. So that would be, you know, my recommendation for work plan moving forward over the next few weeks and month. Open to feedback on that, of course, either now or you know, welcome to take questions, you know, over email as well. So with that, I will, you know, motion to adjourn. I think we've concluded our business for today.
Motion to adjourn.
And Marcia Parham Green.
Not hearing any objections, we are concluded for today. Really great discussion today. So thank you for that. Thank you for the work that went into this, and looking forward to our continued conversations. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks, everyone.
It
Thanks
was
all.
an excellent discussion.
Thank you.